Chapter 5 of Winning His Way by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5, in which Duncan Roach visits the Argus office. The first issue of the Green River Argus under the direction of Frank Morris appeared on time, notwithstanding the condition in which it had been left by Mr. Jebb and his associates, and the boy's political leader, backed up with his heart-to-heart talk with his readers, created a favorable impression in town. Squire Roach had been much disappointed as well as disgusted by the refusal of Mrs. Morris to accept even $1,500 for the paper when he approached her on the subject the preceding afternoon. His feelings were certainly not improved when Mr. Jebb called upon him later with the intelligence that he had been summarily dismissed as editor and manager of the Argus. Later on, he learned that Mr. Robinson had also been discharged, and that Foreman Billings had transferred his valuable services to the Times. Under these circumstances, he was disagreeably surprised to find his copy of the Argus lying beside his plate as usual Saturday morning when he entered the breakfast room. It had been his impression that the paper wouldn't be out till late in the day, if it came out at all, a fact that was pretty certain to raise an indignant howl from its subscribers. But there it was, just as if nothing had occurred to interfere with the internal workings of the Argus establishment. "Mr. Jebb must have left the paper all ready to be printed," was his private comment as he unfolded the sheet and proceeded to look up the editorial written by his ready tool on lines suggested by himself, a proof of which he had already corrected. But lo! The editorial was missing, while in its place he found Frank's vigorous contribution. "What in thunder? Who in thunder wrote that?" he ejaculated in a tone of strong disapproval. "And where is the editorial I ordered put in?" "What is the matter, father?" asked Duncan, surprised by his father's vehemence. "Matter!" exclaimed Squire Roach. "There is considerable the matter. Read that editorial, and let me know if you think that young monkey Frank Norris could have written it. I don't believe he has the ability." "Frank Morris write that?" said Duncan Roach after he had finished reading the leader. "He did like fun. What makes you think he did?" "Well, I don't know who could have written it. Mr. Jebb wouldn't have presumed to do it, for it is against the policy I mapped out for him to follow." "What has Frank Morris got to do with the Argus, anyway?" asked Duncan, for he had not heard of the change which had taken place in its management. "He seems to have a good deal to do with it," grunted the squire in a vexed tone. "His mother has not only refused to sell me the paper, but has actually turned it over to that young whippersnapper." "Turn the Argus over to Frank Morris?" exclaimed Duncan, greatly surprised. "Yes, and has begun to run things with a high hand. The first thing he did was to discharge Mr. Jebb." "Who's going to run the paper for him, then?" "He expects to do it himself, so he told Mr. Jebb." "Oh, he run the Argus. Run it into the ground, maybe," said Duncan Roach scornfully. "I've no doubt but he will do that. What can he expect to do without experience?" "Well, all I've got to say is he's got cast-iron nerve," sneered Duncan. "He has certainly no lack of assurance," conceded the squire. "He'll end in a bust-up. That's some satisfaction." "I don't see how he will be able to avoid it," said the squire, recovering his good humor at this reflection. "And then you'll be able to buy the paper at the sheriff's sale," grinned his son. "I shall certainly try to purchase it if it goes under the hammer. I'll be on hand when the beggar is sold out, and give him the grand laugh," said Duncan maliciously. "Duncan, you must not express such uncharitable sentiments toward your neighbor," said the elder Roach reprovingly. "Oh," snorted Duncan, "I hate the fellow." "Duncan, you surprise me. How about that mortgage you hold on the Morris cottage?" asked the boy. "What about it?" "Maybe they won't be able to pay that when it comes due." "The Argus ought to fetch enough to settle that, even at a forced sale. Mrs. Morris was certainly ill-advised not to accept the $1,500 I offered her yesterday for the paper as it stands. I'm afraid she will have occasion to regret not having done so. I dare say she would have closed with me but for her son. If she allows that duffer Frank to run her affairs, she can't blame you for bidding in her property as cheap as possible when it comes to be sold out." "Certainly not," said Squire Roach complacently. "I have made her a very fair proposition, and by refusing it, she takes all the risk on her own shoulders." "Women are queer, anyway," remarked Duncan jeeringly. This was more than his mother, who had been a quiet listener to the conversation, could stand. "Duncan, are you aware what you're saying?" she said severely. "Oh, you know what I mean," replied the boy rather flippantly. "I don't wish to hear such a remark from you in the future. It is a reflection on me as well as the persons you have in your mind." Duncan thought it advisable to keep quiet for a little while, and when he opened his mouth again, the conversation had turned into another channel. "I'm glad I don't have to work for a living," he said to himself complacently, when an hour later he peered in at one of the street windows of the Argus composing room and observed Dan Harwood, stick in hand, hustling away for dear life at a rush job that had just been received by Frank. Then he concluded he would enter the office and see how things were getting on without the talented Mr. Jebb, notwithstanding the fact that he and Frank were not on good terms. "I'll make the beggar do a job for me," he said, thinking he saw a way to annoy the young editor of the Argus, quite overlooking the fact that he would really be doing the establishment a small service. So in he walked with a poor imitation of his father's ponderous strut and air of superiority. Frank, who was seated at the business desk making out his advertising bills for that week, looked up and regarded his presence with some surprise. "Hello, Morris," said Duncan superciliously. "I hear you're the boss of this outfit now. As I like to encourage beginners, I thought I'd drop in and give you a job." "I'm much obliged to you for thinking of me," replied Frank with a queer little smile. "Small favors are thankfully received. What can I do for you?" "I dare say you need all the work you can get to keep the place out of the hands of the sheriff," grinned the young Roach maliciously. "I don't think the sheriff will bother me," answered the young editor quietly. "You don't expect to make the Argus pay, do you?" asked Duncan in surprise. "I see no reason why I shouldn't." "Oh!" snorted Duncan. "My father says the paper was running at a loss even under Mr. Jebb, who was a first-class newspaper man. You're only a boy with no experience. How can you expect to do any better?" "By attending strictly to business and doing the best I can," answered Frank pleasantly. "What kind of a job do you want done?" "I want some visiting cards. I'd like to see some of your samples. I couldn't use anything common, you know," said young Roach loftily. Frank took down a pasteboard box containing samples of card work executed at the office, and picked out several specimens of the best. "That's the best wedding, Bristol, and will cost you 50 cents for 50 or 75 cents for 100. "Haven't you got anything better?" inquired Duncan. "The specimen you have in your hand is the best stock in the market. You can see that it was selected by Judge Smith." "Do the Smiths have their printing done here?" asked the young aristocrat in a tone of surprise, for Mrs. Smith was the acknowledged leader of Green River's most exclusive sect. "Certainly," said Frank with an amused smile. "I always thought they had their work done in Chicago," said Duncan. "We can do job work as well as it is done in Chicago as far as our line type permits." "Then how do you account for the Times taking so much of your printing away from you?" asked Duncan, feeling as if he had scored a point. "I am not prepared to discuss that point," said Frank with dignity. "I expect to recover whatever trade we have lost of late." "You think you will?" sneered Duncan. "I guess the Times knows how to hold on to its work all right. I hear you've lost your foreman." "I can spare him." "That's because you haven't got enough to keep a good man." "I've got a perfectly competent printer." "I suppose you mean Dan Harwood." "I do. He's only a boy. Billings calls him a two-thirder. He's got a lot to learn." "Shall I print you 50 of these cards?" asked Frank, not caring to continue the discussion. "You may as well make it 100, for I use a good many of them," said Duncan pompously. "A person in my position naturally does, you know." "All right," said Frank. "I suppose you want your address on them?" "Certainly. When can I have them?" "This afternoon, if you wish." "Very well, I will call for them. I suppose you'd like me to pay in advance so you can buy the cards?" said Duncan, pulling out a roll of bills. "It is unnecessary," replied the young editor, ignoring the inference his enemy intended to convey. "I keep an ample stock on hand." Just then a very pretty young girl walked into the business office. "Delighted to meet you, Miss Gray," said Duncan, raising his hat to the visitor with one of his most fetching smiles. "Shall I have the pleasure?" But Elsie Gray cut him short with a freezing look and then turned away. She had not forgotten his conduct on a previous occasion, when Frank Morris had found it necessary to interfere between them on her behalf. Duncan, greatly embarrassed, smothered an angry expression which rose to his lips, and walked stiffly out of the office. End of chapter 5.